Tracy Weston, sit down. I'm the chair of the board of Common Cause. I can tell the board what to do. And for those of you who are tuning in, my name is Robert Reich. I want to thank you for joining us at Common Cause. And I also want to thank, I guess, properly my guest. You are a guest, my guest. Bill Kristol, who is an old friend, editor of the Weekly Standard. Bill and I go back to the early 1980s. We were just talking about being on the playground, or not actually. We were not on the playground.
We're not that young, right?
Yeah, we were with our children, or more accurately, Bill's wife and I were with our relative sets of little children who are now in their 30s. And we've taken slightly different paths. But actually, in some ways, I suspect, Bill, we haven't taken as radical a set of different paths as we otherwise might appear to have taken. And I want to talk a little bit about democracy with you, because that is arguably under assault. And maybe that's the place to begin. Do you think it is, to some extent, under assault today?
Yeah, clearly. Well, thanks for having me, first of all, Bob, and thank you all for having me. Well, clearly it is, both around the world and here in the U.S. There's no question that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, everyone thought, not everyone, many people thought that somehow things were fated to go in a positive direction. The end of history was going to be increased democracy. There might be hiccups occasionally, but this was the future. I think I always thought that was a little bit overly optimistic. The forces of illiberalism don't go away just because one major force of illiberalism, Soviet communism, collapses, and because Nazism and fascism have been discredited and defeated, more importantly than discredited perhaps 40 years before. And sure enough, there have been various forms of illiberalism that have revived around the world and here in the U.S. Not much question about it. So I think democracy, liberal democracy, is under threat, and more so than it has been certainly since 1989. And I do think that they're connected, incidentally. Trump is, we're very obsessed. I'm anti-Trump, so very interested. I'm American, so for me, Donald Trump is a very big deal, but it is worth just saying the obvious, which is he is part of a broader international phenomena and is, in fact, in touch with others like him around the world.
Well, that phrase, others like him, I want to focus on that a little bit, because you are, I think you would, I don't know whether you would describe yourself as a conservative and a Republican, but you have been described that way.
Yeah.
I have been described as a liberal and a Democrat, and yet both of us have, I think it's fair to say, severe concerns, doubts about Donald Trump. I just shared with the Common Cause board some of the research I've been doing in how democracies move from democracy to totalitarianism and authoritarianism. I don't think America is in any imminent danger. I think we are more resilient, for example, than Germany in the 1920s and 30s, or Italy at that time, or certainly Russia before Stalin. Or even Russia, the Soviet Union and Russia before Putin, to take some examples. We were founded by people who were most concerned about avoiding tyranny, and they created a constitutional system designed basically to avoid the possibility that Donald Trump could do a lot of damage. Maybe they even thought about Donald Trump. But here's the question. I mean, in what ways, and I shared with the board the ways in which tyrants do take over, but in what ways are you particularly concerned about Trump? Maybe that's one way of zeroing in on our joint concerns.
Yeah, no, I think actually if you read the Federalist Papers, there are passages where there's the concern about demagogues.
They don't, in the Federalist 38, I think Hamilton referred to somebody called D.T., but he didn't describe exactly who that was.
Very, very, very prescient, our forefathers.
Very prescient.
Yeah. No, there really are discussions of demagogues and of how the arts of demagogues will be checked, it is hoped, by a host of American institutions, ranging from separation of powers to federalism, the Electoral College they had hopes in, which that got transformed over the years. I guess I would say two things. I mean, I do think our Constitution and our institutions are pretty strong and pretty resilient and are being tested today, and one wishes they didn't have to be tested. It would be nice to go through life without these kinds of tests. In a way, the testing could be good for them, honestly, and good for us. You know, we've taken too much for granted for too long. Let's be serious about why we care about something like the separation of powers. You mentioned, I think when you were speaking earlier, the courts, the legislative branches, federalism, independent institutions, a private sector. Those of us who are on the conservative side have been on the whole friendlier to the private sector than to government. One of the arguments, one of the principled arguments for keeping government under control is that if someone bad gets in charge of the federal government, he has less control over the country if there are stronger independent institutions, whether those are universities or corporations or not-for-profits or the media.
Or labor unions.
Labor unions, yeah, well, that's true. And that was the classic argument, one of the classic American arguments for labor unions. Private sector labor unions, I would say, maybe more particularly. But so I think, on the whole, I'm not, panicked or that alarmed. I think the institutions are strong. And I also don't think Trump is really, he has authoritarian tendencies. He toys with and plays with very unseemly and unattractive aspects of a demagogue's message and an authoritarian's message. I'm not sure he has the personal discipline or vision, if you can call it that, to be a successful authoritarian. Let's hope not. People around him have thought, unfortunately, a little more about this. And,
well, I was just going to get to that.
Okay.
I don't know if you know Bannon.
I just met him like once or twice, not really.
But there are people around him like Bannon and Miller who have thought a lot about these issues and who seem to be egging him on. I don't know. But there are a lot of people in the Republican Party who seem to be silent in the face of this. And that's what worries me. Silence in the face of creeping potential demagoguery or even tyranny is almost being complicitous, is it not?
Yeah, and yes, I think it can be, and I didn't vote for Trump, but I'm distressed that so many Republicans ended up supporting him, thinking that, well, they can manage him, contain him, get good policy outcomes despite him, and so forth. Some of those arguments aren't ridiculous, and we'll see what happens. He's only been president, 7 weeks or so? It seems like about 7 years, but Trump is amazing, right? Doesn't it feel like he's like President Obama was sort of another decade or something like that? It's like Trump years are like dog years, Each one is about seven times as long as it's. Anyway, no, and I'm a little somewhat distressed. I would say, to be fair, the fact that a bunch of Republican senators have voted to confirm a bunch of nominees who are mostly pretty conventional Republican cabinet nominees, and doesn't prove that they're going to go along with his legislative agenda, let alone go along with all kinds of other things he's doing. But I think people have been too cavalier in assuming that, those are just the tweets. This is just him popping off. And I do think there's an underestimation of how much damage he can do to trust in our basic institutions, certain basic decency of American public life, which God knows is frayed around the edges many, many times over the decades. But still, he's taken it to a new level, I would say. I'm less worried about Trump mounting an authoritarian coup and more worried about a general degradation of democratic institutions and democratic discourse and a kind of chaos resulting, which in turn can lead to sort of worse versions of Trump. I mean, everyone has this kind of, on the left and right, I'm struck by this, Trump is the problem. If we can control Trump, contain him, get beyond him, figure out a strategy, that everything's fine. But of course, presumably the things that have produced Trump, unless things turn around, could produce another Trump. And this is the danger, would be a more serious, more forceful, younger,
Smarter,
yeah, more disciplined Trump. I mean, Trump could end up being the canary in the coal mine in a very bad way, where he's just the kind of, and this was true if you look at some of the instances in Italy, Germany, Russia before 1917, where we ended up with a really horrible dictators. It's not like there weren't precursors to those people, right? So I don't think Trump is the dictator, probably. Is he a precursor of a kind of degradation of our democratic institutions? That I would worry about a lot. And I think on that, yes, I'm worried about conservatives and Republicans not being serious enough about that. It's hard, as you know, it's, to be fair, it's your party and you know the people. One knows the people in the White House and the administration, and one talks oneself into a certain kind of excessive confidence that he can be controlled, managed, contained. And, you go to, I'm not go to meetings at the White House, but other people go to meetings at the White House. They're discussing the health care bill, and it's not that different from a meeting with any other Democratic or Republican president and cabinet officers discussing the health care bill. And you can sort of fool yourself into thinking it's normalcy, you know?
Exactly.
I think it's very important that we not allow Trump to be normalized. It's a hard thing not to allow because he is president. So what are you saying when you say, well, we can't allow Trump to be rationalized or normalized? It's a little, you know, he is president. He'll act as such. People aren't going to sit in Congress and watch the State of the Union and so forth. So it's a complicated, actually, situation. And I think it's a challenge, probably particularly for Republicans and conservatives, but a little bit for liberals and Democrats as well.
I think it's absolutely. I mean, the question really that comes to mind, sitting here talking to you, is how liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, come together in a bipartisan coalition to protect, as you put it, democratic institutions and democratic discourse.
I mean, I guess I'd put it this way. In the meeting before we went on Facebook Live here, people were talking a little bit about the defense budget and about or other, you know, public policy topics, let's call it. Judge Gorsuch would be something where there's a lot of partisan division. I just think it's important somehow. We are entitled to have normal partisan politics in the age of Trump, and we're going to have them. If you think Neil Gorsuch is a very bad Supreme Court justice and is going to roll the Constitution back in ways you don't like, you're entitled to oppose him. I like Gorsuch and like his basically constitutional philosophy, so I'll support him. We should be able to have that debate and have it pretty vigorously, as we have had many such debates vigorously in the last 3-4 decades. If you think the defense budget is too high, and if I think it's too low, whether, you know, we can dispute whether it should be 4% or 5% of GDP. That's not both are well within the norms of American history and modern history, and neither impinges one way or the other, particularly on American democracy. Somehow, distinguishing normal policy debates and the ability to have those vigorously from those areas where we should be able to come together on the fundamental questions of the norms and institutions of liberal democracy. I think that's the task.
Exactly.
I'm not sure many of us is that far along. It's been only 6-7 weeks, and you know, these things do get muddied up too. Of course, it's not as if the world is going to sort itself neatly into these two baskets. But I guess that's the way I would try to think about it.
I agree with you, and that's where I come up to the big question mark, because we are so accustomed to having debates around the particular policy issues that come to either big government or small government, or issues of social conservatism versus various forms of libertarianism on the left and the right. We don't have the habit of discussing democratic institutions and the fragility or the danger to them, and also democratic discourse, the danger of hatefulness, the danger of us being divided against each other because we just no longer feel that we're part of the same enterprise. And the question, and I think it's probably the most important question we as a nation now face, and European nations face similar kinds of questions, is how do we begin the kind of discourse that we need across party lines and across the old ideological divisions.
And are there things we can agree on as a practical matter that would sort of undergird that discourse? Otherwise, it can look like just talk.
Yeah. Well, for example, an attack on the Congressional Budget Office,
right,
or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which we were just talking about on the board. To me, I have, at least since 1974, when the Congressional Budget Office was set up, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, actually before that, I have always felt that those agencies were incredibly important in terms of telling the truth. And attacking those institutions, and this is sort of emblematic of a much broader attack on truth-telling institutions, undermines our capacity to make decisions as a democracy.
And somehow distinguishing between a sophisticated critique of the CBO for not taking account of A, B, or C, or whatever, and pointing out there are legitimate disagreements about all these policy consequences of various policies on the one hand, and the fundamental undermining of sort of, there are facts about these policies, and X number of people will or won't be covered, or are not covered by health insurance and so forth. I think that's very important. But I think it does get a lot of it to the nature of Trump's particular attacks. And again, I think if I were advising liberals and Democrats, something I don't get asked to do very often, but what the heck, been happy to offer this advice. It's worth what you're paying for it. I think it's really important when Trump says that Barack Obama tapped my phones, I mean, A, it's crazy, and it didn't happen, one assumes. And I mean, what is it? And it's different in nature from a normal partisan, Obamacare is a terrible failing program. Fine, that's just normal political, exaggerated rhetoric of people like me who don't like Obamacare much and prefer refundable tax credits, and conversely, the same kind of rhetoric. And somehow, really calling Trump on those kinds of things, and that's where I think one can ask conservatives and Republicans, wait a second, you're entitled to vote for an increase in the defense budget, you're entitled to vote for Neil Gorsuch, but you cannot sit quietly when the current president of the United States accuses his predecessor with no evidence at all, of, quote, tapping his phones, which think what that implies. It implies that the current director of the FBI was complicit in that, and presumably a whole chain of people in the CIA and FBI and elsewhere in the U.S. government. That he didn't personally go out there and do it, presumably Barack Obama in the middle of the night there at Trump Tower. So, and that really does delegitimize our institutions. I mean, that kind of conspiracy mongering. And there are many other things. The press is not just biased or limited in its views. A lot of us would agree that it sometimes misses a lot of things. It's kind of, Washington, New York based, and doesn't see a lot of things that are happening in Middle America and so forth. But it's enemies of the people. Didn't I think Trump said that recently? People on the right tend to make fun of me for, you're getting too upset about Trump's tweets. These are just tweets. Let's just see how he governs. That's kind of the sophisticated conservative rationalization for not getting too alarmed about Trump. And there's some truth in that, obviously. At the end of the day, he could be a jerk and irresponsible, and the country could chug along, and the economy will or won't improve, and our foreign policy will or won't be run responsibly, and people will get nominated for positions and so forth. But I don't know. I just think if you're the president of the United States, it's not like any random commentator making irresponsible comments. The president of the United States doing that sort of thing, I think there one is entitled to ask people in both parties to say, wait a second, that really is that is doing damage to basic confidence and trust in our liberal democratic institutions. Well, I think conversely, it's also fair to say to liberals and stuff that, fine, you can think Charles Murray's social science isn't very good, but you should not be quiet when he's shouted down by a mob at Middlebury, and that really is bad, and that really is, really it's the kind of thing you do not want to see in the United States, certainly on college campuses, which is supposed to be the place where free speech is particularly respected, but you don't want to see it in the country as a whole. So I think both sides have some responsibility to step up here in a way against, people on their own fringes who don't accept the basic norms of liberal democracy.
Is there also a way, Bill, for both sides, as you just put it, to visibly and powerfully come together? That is, we are so entrenched in different modes of communicating and different places in people's consciousness and our own even narrow casting in terms of the internet and the ways in which people even absorb and get information. What are the avenues open to us if we wanted to say it is inappropriate for Charles Murray to be shouted down, or it's inappropriate for the President of the United States and for the White House to call the press the enemies of the people, or to take on these truth-telling institutions like OMB and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and to do much else? How do we magnify and amplify our voice so that it's not just a partisan voice, or it's not just a voice crying in the wilderness?
Yeah. Well, look, that's a big question, and I think a lot of us have been trying to think about that over the last few weeks and months. Like November 8th, I guess, was Election Day, so what are we, December, January? We're still four months in, which sounds like a lot in a way, but in a way it's not very long in terms of people processing this and trying to think through what should be done either institutionally or organizationally. And I don't know. Obviously, what can be done can range from, an op-ed co-authored by two people who normally don't agree but say, can't we agree on these basic things? Bill Galston and I tried to do a little version of that, but that's just an op-ed, obviously. One could imagine much more, organizational and institutional things at the local level, the state level, and the national level, or the international level. I was talking with Garry Kasparov, the great Russian, greatest chess player in history, I believe, but also a very great Russian dissident and human rights activist, who was talking about couldn't one have an international organization? There were these kinds of things more in the 50s and 60s, I would say, of sort of ranging from democratic socialists to Democratic conservatives and quite conservative conservatives in some cases, standing together in defense of liberal democracy in Europe and the United States. It doesn't have to just be Europe. It was mostly then in the 50s, obviously. And I think that's not without utility. A lot of those things, you have a conference, what does it really lead to? But I think just showing the flag and having a certain kind of reinforcing of one another. Things could get worse. I mean, what's going to happen in these elections in Europe? I think people are still slightly too, I'd say people were maybe too hysterical about Trump right after Election Day. Exams had to be canceled on college campuses because it was such a shock and all that. And a lot of people on the right made fun of that. But I actually think people are a little too complacent now about what the world could look like 6 or 9 months from now. I mean, the Dutch elections, the French election in particular, you could have real challenges to the kind of what we've come to think of as the post-war liberal order. Now, some of those challenges are legitimate, and no one has to sign on and, to love everything that's happened for the last 25 or 75 years, and God knows there are legitimate critiques of aspects of that order. But I don't think we've quite reckoned with what that really looks like in the real world abroad. And then what if we get a recession or something at home? What's amazing about Trump, and I would put Sanders a little bit in this category too, and it's not that he's like Trump, but in the sense that he's sort of outside of what had been the mainstream of the Democratic Party. I'm not saying this even pejoratively. I just think analytically he's, we hadn't had a previous Democratic candidate who had been a socialist and proclaimed himself a socialist, couldn't join the Democratic Party because it was too conservative until a year before he ran and so forth. 45% of Americans voted for Trump or Sanders. There's 45% in the Republican primaries voted for Trump. It's kind of nice parallel, almost exact. 45% of Democrats voted for Sanders. Sanders had the problem that he only had one opponent, and so he lost, in effect, 55-45, whereas Trump won because he had a fragmented field. But to have that level of discontent with the mainstream of both parties, and you and I have both been critics of the mainstream in many ways, and I'm not unhappy to have some discontent and shake things up, but I don't think everyone should have just rolled over and said, let's have Clinton and Bush. I mean, in a way, Trump was so helped by the fact that his first opponent was Bush and then Clinton. It's almost like you couldn't, in a novel, make it sort of easier to be the anti-establishment, anti-business as usual, anti-last quarter century. Everything has been great. The elites have been doing great. Let's just have another Clinton-Bush choice. It's sort of almost comical, and Trump benefited hugely from that. But having said that, the degree of discontent that 45% in each party suggests, when we weren't in the middle of a recession, we'd had a very nasty, obviously, one in 07, 08. We weren't in the middle of a terrible foreign war, Vietnam, let alone World War II or something like that. We weren't in the middle, really, of huge scandals in government. Whatever criticisms one has of Obama or the Republicans. I mean, it wasn't, and
we were not in the middle of, at least in this country, of a wave of terrorism.
Right.
And which really gets to the final thing I want to talk, and we're going to turn it over to. A lot of people have questions because this is Facebook Live, and then the board would like to ask some questions as well. But if there ever could be a kind of liberal democratic coalition across parties, across ideologies, that really focused on preserving and building democratic institutions and democratic discourse, part of that presumably would be a reform agenda that would try to deal with that underlying discontent, which I believe has a lot to do with people's sense of corruption, that these institutions are rigged in some sense. I mean, I was struck by how often in the election of 2016, conservatives and liberals, Trump and Sanders particularly, but really more than Trump and Sanders, talked about, use the term crony capitalism, or the rigging of the political economic system, or other terms that conveyed and mirrored a broad cross-section of America's conclusion that essentially politics is corrupt and indirectly our economy is corrupt because politics determines to some extent the rules of the economy. So there's a long way of asking the question, but doesn't there have to be a reform agenda? And doesn't that reform agenda have to focus on, however you want to define corruption, this underlying sense that the system is rigged?
Yes, I mean, I think it's obviously a good way of putting it. And I guess I would say this, I mean, just back to the point you made, actually, good point about terrorism. We hadn't had that much of that either, actually, in the country in the last year, thank God. I mean, there's a couple of bad incidents, but which does, just to be alarmist for a second, what will it look like in a year or two or three if there's a recession, if the war on terror, from our point of view, doesn't go well, and there are terror attacks here or elsewhere, if there's minor or even not so minor foreign policy catastrophes, God knows what could happen around the world, North Korea and so forth. I mean, what level of dissatisfaction do you get, and how open to demagogues on right or left, I would say, do people get then, both in the U.S. and elsewhere? I think it's worth being pretty alarmed. I mean, the conservative reform ideas, I was very hopeful. There were these things called reformicons, which were kind of the conservative reformists, 2010, 11, 12, 13. A lot of good ideas, I think, different in spirit from the reform ideas. Well, different in spirit, different in detail and direction, perhaps, from the reform ideas on the liberal left, but same idea of addressing wage stagnation among working class Americans and other aspects of the system, the declining mobility, et cetera, social mobility, labor mobility for that matter. It's amazing how that all just got swamped, you might say, by Trump. I still think those ideas remain a lot of them are quite good, and I suppose one shouldn't get too distorted by Trump. If they're good ideas, and they should be advanced. And maybe one thing to do would just be to sort of take a deep breath and say we should all oppose Trump and Trumpism and other things, as in certain ways. Meanwhile, we can't be paralyzed in terms of developing an agenda, both on the left and the right, for what we should be doing to address these real problems in America or around the world. So I very much agree with that. I think it would be a big mistake if everyone just threw themselves. I mean, it's tempting to throw oneself full time into sort of dealing with everything Trump does and his supporters do, and then to some degree with some on the other side, on the left do, but that would be a big mistake. So I very much agree with that. I also do think, and here I'll lean a little the other way, and this is why it's complicated, I think it's important to also defend what is pretty much sensible about the post-war liberal order, both internationally and at home. I mean, a lot of people, I'm a Republican, of course, some people, those Republican elites, they were so out of touch, the working class was so unhappy, trade, immigration, and they should have just been much more in touch and much more aware of these problems. And I would say, well, a lot of people were aware of these problems. Jeb Bush isn't a foolish person. He knows there were real problems. But he actually believes that, generally speaking, the free trade order around the world has been good for the world and good for America. He generally believes that a more liberal immigration policy is good for America and good for our neighbors and for that matter, good for the world in certain ways. And so what's he supposed to do to be, quote, in touch, just give up on things he thinks are actually better for the country? Now, could he do a better job of explaining certain policies? And of course, in politics, you have to adjust policies to reality, and I understand all that. But so I think one has to both defend what's worth defending at the same time while one tries to reform what needs to be reformed. And that's a little tricky as a sort of twofold set of responsibilities, but I think both need to be done.
I have so many things I'd like to talk about with you, Bill, from this point on. But let me just, if we do have questions, and these are presumably questions for both of us, but not this first one.
I was about to say, you should talk a little more here, so
okay. Do conservatives as a whole agree with this administration and its methods? Why or why not? This is from Jason. And I don't think Jason wants you to speak for all conservatives.
Yeah, right.
So you're speaking for yourself.
Well, no, I don't. And I think it's very much an open question whether they do. A lot of people ask me a version of this question, which is, how does it feel to be part of Trump's Republican Party? And I always say it's not Trump's Republican Party. He, in a somewhat fluky way, honestly, won the nomination and then drew an inside straight on the election through the Electoral College. And most Republicans in the House and Senate, if you just look at their actual platforms, or to be fair, at their actual conduct in public life, are not Trumpy, I would say, and didn't run like Trump and don't much like Trump. But the proof will be in the pudding or in the eating of the pudding. I agree. And if 2 years from now, I mean, the danger is that people like me can say that now, but as people accommodate to Trump, and maybe Trump has some short-term successes, and then he and his friends aren't held accountable for things he says or things they do, you could see a real erosion of the Republican Party and the conservative movement toward Trump. I don't think that's happened. I hope it doesn't happen, but it's worrisome.
Elena on Facebook asks, what will it take for the GOP to look closely at Trump's ties to Russia?
Well, some in the GOP are looking at it, and I've been most vociferous about it. And we just need to find out the truth, and hopefully there will be congressional inquiries or other inquiries that will expose perhaps what we don't know.
Phyllis asks, and this is something actually that I was going to push you on. Is there anything we the people, now this is not left or right, we can do to protect democracy in the age of Trump? And this gets to what I was just about to ask you. Even if we could agree to some ways to reform the economy so that it seemed and felt and in fact was less rigged economically, and the middle class and the working class and the poor got a larger proportion of the gains from the economy, don't we also have to, in fact, isn't a prerequisite for that, to get big money out of politics, to make reforms in terms of how of gerrymandering, of voter suppression, of every way in which our political system seems, and in many respects is, rigged for the benefit of those who already have power?
I'm not really convinced of that. I'm convinced that there should be political reforms as well. I'm just not convinced money is the heart of the problem. Bernie Sanders showed that someone like him who challenged the system could raise a huge amount of money, and he didn't lose to Hillary Clinton because of money. He lost to her just because he couldn't quite get over the top in appealing to voters. And of course, Jeb Bush had by far the most money on the Republican side. So gerrymandering, I'm against it. I'd be open to an Iowa-type system where you have nonpartisan districts. I wouldn't, on the other hand, say that the congressmen from Iowa are noticeably more responsible than the congressmen from other states. I believe a congressman from Iowa has just been in the news this week. And that is a state, literally, that has, do you know this? It has that, it has that kind of nonpartisan system so that the districts are cut, don't look like districts in Virginia where I live. They're just cut up neatly into quarters, or there are 4 of them, I think, in Iowa, or 5. So I'm just not sure how much. I was for, actually, reluctantly for McCain-Feingold in 2002. Weekly Standard wrote a couple of editorials for it. Fred Wertheimer and I had nice conversations about it. I don't know how much good that did. You could say it would have done good if not for Citizens United. I'm not entirely convinced of that either. So I think the money thing can sometimes, there's an awful lot of money in the U.S. that's going to be spent on an awful lot of things, and some of it will be spent on, and luckily it's pretty dispersed ideologically, honestly. So I'm not so sure that money is the heart of the problem. But I do think thinking about political and institutional reforms that really give people a sense they are in control of their own lives is very important. For me, I've become much more of a fan of decentralization than I was 20 or 30 years ago. I just think it's really important for people to have the sense they can control some parts. Some things work nationally, and Social Security, that's fine. You're not going to decentralize that. But there are a lot of things that really could be, and here the internet can be a force for good, I think. They really could be driven down, not quite to local levels, but let's just say to citizen levels and the level of citizen groups working together in ways that would be healthy, I think, for the country. But that's a vague answer.
Well, I want to agree. Certainly after 7 or 8 weeks of Trump, I'm now more in favor of decentralization than I ever thought I would be.
Right, well, yeah.
And even from the standpoint of California, I'm talking about states' rights.
Right.
Never thought I would be. But I think that the general point is that economic reform and political reform go hand in glove. It's very hard to do one without the other. And hopefully, if we ever did have a democratic sort of coalition, small d, part of that democratic small d movement would be to examine ways in which trust can be revived in our system, our political economic system. When you and I were teaching years ago at the Kennedy School, the question was asked, do you trust the American system, including the government, to do the right thing most of the time? And as I recall, in the early 80s, something in the order of 40, 50%, we were alarmed because that was a big, big drop from what it was in the 1960s. But now, as you know, when asked, do you trust government to do the right thing most of the time, or do you trust big corporations, or do you trust the media? Really, the lack of trust is the most dominant aspect of those polls and our time, which opens the door to demagogues.
And it is a bit of a catch-22, or whatever the right way to say it is. I mean, chicken and egg, because there's nothing that a few successful policies wouldn't do. I'll say this the right way. A few successful policies would do a lot to restore trust, right? I mean, part of the failure of trust is that people said we knew what we were doing. Don Rumsfeld had this very sophisticated view of how to fight the war in Iraq. It turned out not to be correct. Alan Greenspan and others really had figured out how to get risk out of the international financial system. They had very sophisticated, spreading out those mortgages into 1,000 different pieces. That was really going to help because it's so risky to hold the whole mortgage yourself. And then it turned out to almost bring the whole thing down. I do think those things did a lot of damage. You can't really blame the public for thinking, do these elites know what they're talking about? And that's in some ways a healthy. We want that attitude, right? And that's a healthy traditional American attitude. You and I wrote pieces like that, whether on foreign policy or financial policy. Obamacare, at other instances where they allegedly had it all worked out, and it turns out all kinds of parts of it weren't quite. They either made deals they maybe shouldn't have made, or parts of it didn't work the way they hoped, and so forth. And so I think a certain distrust of experts can be healthy, but it can also slide pretty easily into being exploited by demagogues, and it becomes a distrust not just of experts, but of even the idea of expertise, and then even the idea of facts or arguments as opposed to emotions and resentments. I do think in that respect Trump is really, we've had a lot of people like, if I can get back to Trump, the obsession, having said we should get beyond Trump, I'll get back to Trump for a second. And for me, there were plenty of people like Trump in American history. I mean, Joe McCarthy maybe is the most famous on the right, but there were, I would say, not Huey Long in certain ways. They've been irresponsible demagogues.
But they haven't been president.
No, that is the key point. They've achieved high office. Senator, governor, they've been spoken about as president. Trump, partly through luck and flukiness, and partly just through the way our system is set up now, and partly maybe because the crisis is a little deeper, made it to the presidency. And in a way, one shouldn't maybe freak out about that. I mean, he'll make it maybe just for one term, and then we'll go back to a more normal system, and the demagogues will pop up every 20 years on right and left, and they'll get Pat Buchanan, Ron Paul, whatever, and they'll get 20% of the votes in some primary, or they'll win one Senate seat or one governorship, and they'll kind of go away. Or not. I mean, that's the real question for Trump that people really need to think through. I mean, him being president for 4 years, presumably, does really change things. I made this, making an argument in our office 2-3 months ago that, or just talking, and saying how fluky it was that he won when you really add up all the things that happened between the primaries and the general election, the electoral college, and Comey, and just a million things that could have, we could be sitting here at a boring Clinton presidency quite easily. And we could have been sitting with a fairly boring, Walker Rubio ticket probably, and if things had gone differently on the Republican side or some kind of ticket. We wouldn't be having this conversation. But as a young colleague of mine pointed out, the fact that it didn't have to happen, which I think is true, doesn't mean that once it's happened, it couldn't have very severe and important and game-changing consequences. World War I didn't have to happen. It was a bunch of totally weird, fluky, contingent events that happened in 1911 to 1914, basically. But once it happens, and then the world gets changed. And I think the key, short, medium-term key, is to prevent Trump from being World War I, if I can put it that way. Trump needs to be a survivable event with the institutions of the country strong, with the parties, one hopes, strong. Maybe not. That's an interesting question. Maybe this is a chance to really rethink the current parties. But whichever way, that we end up with an actual way of channeling voters' wishes, but also their grievances and anxieties in a healthy way. One of the great things about the American system is these anxieties, grievances, even, let's be honest, hatreds and bigotries flare up, and they often find a vehicle for an election cycle or two, and an unattractive vehicle. They tend to often then kind of get calmed down, get subsumed, get channeled into a party that domesticates them and ultimately tames them, and they recede as things get better, perhaps, in the country. I think that's still the right model, ultimately, but it is scarier when you have Trump as president.
And it also, I want to just refer back to something you said and we were talking about when we started, and we have to end this particular portion and the Facebook portion of our program. But if there weren't a Trump now, there might be another Trump. That is, there are conditions, not only the decline of trust in our major democratic institutions, but also a fundamental shift in the economy, starting in the late 70s and early 80s, that was very different from what we experienced in the first 3 decades after the Second World War, in terms of the stagnation of wages. And I can't help but think, and particularly among people who only graduate from college, that the frustrations and angers and anxieties of these people contributed fundamentally to a different kind of American politics. Bernie Sanders' followers were not these people. They were basically young people, but those young people are also facing diminishing prospects, even if they're college graduates. They are laden with debt. They are worried about the future. They have less chance than their parents did, many of them, if their parents had college degrees, of doing well, of affording houses. So you have an economy, a system that has generated a degree of anger and outrage and worry that I think would have contributed to some sort of populist, left-wing, right-wing, however you want to describe it, change somewhere along the line. With the, 2016 could have been 2018. It certainly could have been 2020.
Yeah, two footnotes to that, if I could just permit me before we go off. So I very much agree with that. Someone just came back from doing some focus groups in Donald Trump's America, in Ohio and Pennsylvania and so forth. And he said what struck him was that people, the normal account of it, I would say, is they're, the 52-year-old unemployed steelworker, very hard for him to get a job that's anything remotely like what he had before, plus the loss of dignity and a sense of worth, and all that leads to resentment, and of course it leads to bad social and cultural phenomena as well. But this person said actually he was struck how much people were sort of understood, look, life can be tough and you can be unlucky in the job you take, and this has happened for generations above too, and people had to move from the Dust Bowl to California when they were 52 years old too, and people can sort of tolerate that if they think their kids have a better chance and their grandchildren have a chance. And what struck him was that how worried these working class Trump supporters were, not so much about themselves, there's a little of that obviously, but more about their kids and their grandchildren. And that would fit very much with what you're saying.
In fact, it was striking. 2015, for the first time I have seen it in social science research, a majority of Americans felt that their children were not going to live as well as they did. We have never seen that before. Polls that started in the 30s and 40s after the Second World War, always the people thought that their children were going to live better than they, majority. And now we actually see something different. This is 2015.
Yeah, that's interesting.
We're going to end this. I want to thank everybody who's watching on Facebook or has watched and sent us questions for joining us. And Bill, I want to thank you for joining us. And I want to, as we end this portion of the program, I want to turn it over to the board because I'm sure a lot of people have questions. Can you stay a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.